right, our talk today is really setting the table for what will become an ongoing series for Catholics at Work OC to articulate the Catholic participation in the United States of America as we prepare to celebrate our 250th anniversary. Now, for those that were with us last season, the spring season, we kind of set the table by really taking a deep dive and understanding our Declaration of Independence, where its philosophical roots are found, which are in the teachings of the Catholic Church, which gave rise to the Enlightenment, and the Constitution of the United States, which articulates the rights that come from nature and nature's God, and those that are articulated by man in the Constitution. We had some excellent presentations on that last term. And then we went down and did a deep dive in the Article 3 understanding of how our government is organized. And we did that in particular because of what had happened the preceding November. Does anybody remember what happened in November of 2024? We had an election. And it was a watershed election in the history of our country. And we thought, it's important for us to prepare to understand how we as Catholics at Work OC can take advantage of this moment, because it's going to be a moment of tremendous change. The events of yesterday that Father spoke so perfectly about in his homily really are sitting with all of us, particularly our young men. Now, when I got the news of what happened yesterday, I was in Angel Stadium with about, 20,000 people watching the Halos beat the Twins when the news came out through our digital media. And immediately I got a text from Mr. Padilla talking about how the men were praying for what was going on right then, and sent me a photo. And that really, to me, captured a moment of what's integrating our life of faith and work is all about. Father talked about Charlie and his work, etc., but he's really, for that generation of people, Charlie Kirk represents, along with Lila Rose, along with Ben Shapiro, along with Tucker Carlson, along with Megyn Kelly, along with so many people we call as new media personalities, influencers. They represent for us older guys maybe what Rush Limbaugh was when we were driving our territories and listening to him on the radio and getting formed and informed. So this is a big moment. And for our parents' generation, maybe he is the Edward R. Murrow of their generation that was at the Blitz in London and brought the news to the world. And then those early days of the post-war world, Cronkite, when we still trusted the media on the Tiffany network. In terms of impact on it, this is big. This is a big moment. And it dawned on me how appropriate his organization name was selected, which is Turning Point. We seem to really be in an inflection point in our country and our culture these last 10 years in particular, and probably certainly since the post-Cold War. So we're going to go back and we're going to take a look at America 250, this celebration of the semi-quincentennial and the Catholic presence in it. But again, let's take a look at today's collect prayer just to put a cap on where we are in the history of yesterday in the last 20 hours. O God, by whom we are redeemed and receive adoption, look graciously upon your beloved sons and daughters, that those who believe in Christ may receive true freedom and everlasting inheritance. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever, amen. This collect prayer to me was a tremendous consolation for what Charlie's going through, what his wife Erica is going through, and more importantly, what everyone of this generation is going through, because this is touching really close to heart. So I want to make sure that we always remember that this moment in time, on this 9/11, 24 years later, was a major, major moment. America 250. Probably 10 years ago, the Congress of the United States, in conjunction with the executive branch, said we're going to be coming upon a thing known as the semi-quincentennial, the 250th anniversary of the United States of America. It's going to be a moment to reclaim our identity, to revisit our story, to revisit our history. And so a commission was put together, and it truly is bipartisan. It truly is has a wide range of leaders that put together this experience. If you have not yet downloaded on your device, go to America 250 and save it and drill down and see who the people are that have influenced this, what's going to be a traveling exhibit, both digitally, a place in Washington, D.C., a road show, an invitation for every state to tell their state story, for every civic group to tell its story, what we're doing here today. America 250 will be an amazing opportunity for us to reclaim those things that are really worthy and good and true of being reclaimed, and for us to maybe reconcile those things that we haven't yet reconciled in our nation's past. In my lifetime, when I was in 7th grade, we had a thing called the bicentennial. For you younger guys, that means 200 years. So 200 years of America was an amazing moment where schools and civic organizations and states, and we had a thing called the Freedom Train. I don't know if you ever remember the guys of a certain age. The Smithsonian went on the road on rails, and we were all invited to come and see our nation's story, because travel was a little harder in those days. And so it was an opportunity for us to reclaim and re-understand our story. I think America 250 will be every bit as much so, and more so, because the stakes are more important now for us to understand our story. So before we can understand our story and how important it is, I wanted to just kind of give us an overview of how we at Catholics at Work OC will be slicing up this story and ingesting it 1 month at a time over the next following 8 months. Today we're going to give an overview. We're going to talk about the pre-colonial experience and what brought people from the old world to the new world, and we'll take it right up until really the Pilgrims landing at Plymouth Rock and the Jamestown colonial experience in 1605. Next month, we're going to take a time out from linear history because we're invited by our friend Annette Walker to come and pray and fellowship and learn at the new billion-dollar campus of City of Hope. And so we'll be praying in their new worship space. We'll enjoy their hospitality for breakfast. Annette, a tremendous Catholic leader who's the CEO of the campus, will take us on a tour of the new City of Hope. And then we're going to have a short talk on the Catholic influence of healthcare in the United States. Now, while City of Hope is not a Catholic hospital, Annette, when she spoke to us last time, said she has never been in a more Catholic culture in her time in healthcare, which included being president of St. Joseph's Hospital's Medical Center. She said City of Hope inculcates the culture of Catholicism at every level in its organization. So we'll look forward to visiting City of Hope. We won't be here in October. We'll be at the new campus. When we come back in November, we're doing this series in collaboration with the Camino School. And we're expecting that Martin Bowles will be able to take us on a very interesting deep dive into the history of colonialism through the time of revolution and really the founding of the Republic. In the following month in December, we'll go from the early years of the American experience right after the Constitution. We'll take that through the War with Mexico, 1848. Then we'll take a break for January, we'll be off, and then in February, what we're going to do is we're going to go from that time period where we really received manifest destiny, where all of the territories that had at one point been part of the Spanish Empire and then the Republic of Mexico now are under the responsibility of the United States. We'll take that all the way through the Civil War. Turning point, watershed moment in our nation's history, has to be understood. George Will said, if you want to understand America, there are two things that a person needs to understand. One, the American Civil War, what gave rise to it and what happened during it. Two, you need to understand baseball. Yep. And that's truer than we can imagine. Yesterday I went to the baseball game, not because I'm an Angels fan and I wanted to see the Twins. Yesterday I went to the Angels game because I wanted to take my 8-year-old grandson, Connor, so that we could spend time together in a space where we could be telling our story through the experience of baseball, so that he can start to have a love for the game and the history of the game, and in sowing a history for our country. After the session on the Civil War, we'll then go into Reconstruction through the Industrial Revolution and the Gilded Age. And then the last two sessions will deal with the rise of the First World War through to the Depression, the Second World War, and through the Cold War. And then our last session in May will be a session on the post-Cold War through our time period today. So these next 8 sessions really will be an opportunity for us as Catholics to understand our Catholic story by reflecting on Catholics who were part of each era in that story, some of which are saints, some of which are everyday people, some of which are churchmen, some of which are lay people, some of which are immigrants, some of which were native born. But the Catholic experience in the United States of America through our 250 years and now preparing for the next generation, this is a moment of Catholic ascendancy. Len pointed out that Charlie, who's an evangelical Christian, who, I don't know if you read Dennis Prager's comments on him last night, but Dennis said that he personally, who has an incredibly close relationship with Charlie, was devastated on 3 parts. 1, as an American; 2, as a Jew; 3, as Dennis. And he articulated what that meant. Charlie, in terms of his contribution to where we are, talked about Charlie's absolute bedrock understanding of Israel, its uniqueness as the covenant relationship, and our relationship with not only the Jewish people, but also the Jewish people in exile. And he talked about how the Prager family was impacted by the fact that Charlie was assassinated yesterday, and what that meant to Dennis himself personally, who, as you know, was paralyzed 6 months ago with a fall. And he said one of his asides was that when Dennis was in the hospital and Charlie would come to visit him in the various rehabilitation centers that he's been in for 10 months now, he said when Charlie came, his room was always the most popular room on the floor because Charlie Kirk was there. I think what it means for Dennis Prager to say that about this young man. He also said that his wife of 20 years, Sue, has been sobbing uncontrollably all yesterday because she's so devastated by this impact, right? So again, this Charlie Kirk, important guy, not only for us as Americans, not only for us for our relations, but also just as an individual person, the importance of personal relationships, what we're doing here today and in the people that are in our lives, our family, our friends, our business associates. This is about evangelization. And Len pointed out to me that Charlie has been articulating Catholicism. We're seeing so many of our good Protestant evangelical friends, particularly those who are united with us in the pro-life movement, making their move towards Catholicism. I can even remember a story where there was a Calvary Chapel baptized pagan who became a Bible-believing Jesus movement 70s guy, who then became a Presbyterian minister, who then, through reading the Catechism of the Catholic Church and papal documentation, reasoned himself out of the PCUSA into the Anglican Church, only to receive orders and then to leave the Anglican Church in order to embrace Catholicism, where one day the Lord would call him to orders where he would then be ordained as a Catholic priest. Can you even conceive of such a crazy story? These things are happening all the time. Catholicism in the United States of America, America 250. That's what we're going to be talking about, and hopefully gaining some inspiration for us how we can shine the light of the gospel in our small part in this amazing story. All right, let's talk a little bit about how we got here. 1492. It's the year of the Reconquista. What is the Reconquista?
When the Spanish pushed the Moors back into Africa.
Absolutely. Why was that important? What had been happening for 800 years in the Iberian Peninsula? Exactly. So it's something to accomplish. 1492. Boom. The Reconquista. Their most Catholic majesties, Ferdinand and Isabella, are the ones that accomplished that which nobody thought could be accomplished. They were so integrated with their life of faith and work that they were third order Franciscans. Think about that. You're the king and queen of the kingdoms of Spain. You conquered the Moors. You are the inheritors of the Holy Roman Empire. And yet you embrace Franciscan spirituality for an interior poverty. That is some high-level integration of faith and work. An Italian sailor comes to them with an idea that he might be able to, by sea, find a route to the Indies where he can open up trade and therefore have a monopoly for their most Catholic majesties by not going through the ancient caravan routes, but by going by sea. Now remember, at this time period, nobody knew what was on the other side if they sailed west. And so they invested their capital, and they gave Christopher Columbus the ships, the men, the priests to go with them, and they sailed west. Mr. Padilla, what day did they say we're about to mutiny?
October the 11th, 1492.
And why is that important?
It was the day before the feast of Our Lady of Pilar.
Our Lady of the Pillar, the first Marian apparition in history, took place in 40 AD. It was not only an apparition, it was also an occasion of bilocation, because the Blessed Mother appeared to St. James the Greater and encouraged him to continue to evangelize in what would become Spain. So on that feast, Columbus's guys were done. They were like, hey, forget it, we're going to mutiny, we're going to go the other way. What does Columbus say?
There'll be one more day.
And that one more day, what did they cite? Land ho. They land, and they didn't find the Indies, although they thought they did. What they found was a new world. And so the voyage of discovery gives right to a time period of traumatic change, in which case their most Catholic Spanish majesties, under papal bull, the Inter Caetera, were given rights to the New World to evangelize and to claim that land for Spain and the church. And so all of what they found in the West from a certain demarcation south, what we now call South America, was given to Spain. That was a problem for their neighbors on the Iberian Peninsula, a country called Portugal. Portugal mastered the art of seafaring navigation. It was their technology that was allowing the Spanish crown to send Columbus. And so they had an interior fight, a legal fight. And through legal negotiations, these Catholic kingdoms came to an understanding. And so Portugal was given part of that South American territory, what we now today call Brazil. The vast majority, however, was given to Spain. And so continuous voyages went from Hispaniola to Cuba. From Cuba, they jumped off into Veracruz. Pizarro went south to the Incan Empire. Cortez went to the Aztec Empire. And as he marched across the Mexican peninsula, arrived at Mexico City, Tenochtitlan, where he conquers the Aztec Empire under the command of Moctezuma. And we have a period of conflict. Conqueror and conquered. Now, what did we say happened in 1492? Reconquista. Now, the people that had been conquered for 800 years are now conquering native people. And in order to do that, they destroyed what they understood as their vision of God. So when a people loses its God, they're destroyed, their interior life. Suffering, the pain, not unlike what we're feeling in terms of this assassination yesterday. The interior pain was devastating for the Aztec people. And so for 10 years, they suffered greatly as the conquerors brought in their technology, their understanding of God, etc. And they weren't having much of it, because the Spanish conquest at that time period was usurpation and was particularly harsh. And so at that time period, the native people said, we'd had enough of this. and they were going to rise up and they were going to slaughter their Spanish conquerors. In 1531, what year was the Age of Discovery? 1492. In 1531, what happens? God says, we don't want the Spaniards to get wiped out. What we want to do is to reconcile these people. And so he sends his mother, once again, he sends his mother as a messenger for the native people, speaking to Juan Diego, an Aztec convert. And through his ambassadorial role as a very humble person of a conquered people, he goes to the authority of the church, which was the bishop, Zamorga, and he asks him to do what Our Lady asked, which was to build a temple. He sends the peon away, says, bring me Castilian roses, then maybe I will believe. He comes not only with the roses, but when he drops the roses, again, John, just like the shroud, boom! An image is left on a cloth through some miraculous way, and now we have the tilma 500 years later. Era of conversion takes place throughout what was the Mexican Aztec Empire. 10 million conversions in the next 10 years, happening right at the time in our Christian kingdoms when they were doing what? Falling apart through the Protestant Reformation. So it was Spain sailing for God, for glory, and for gold that brought technology, brought the Christian experience into the New World from the southern route. Well, what about those Christian kingdoms known as France and England? Well, at that time period, they weren't much of kingdoms. They were going through a lot of interior, internal strife. Couldn't quite figure out who was in charge. There was wars in between each others. This new heresy was starting to work its way through in various areas of them. Martin Luther was at work in southern Germany, or northern Germany. You had Calvin and Zwingli over in Switzerland. You had this rebellion going on inside of England because of a small thing called marriage. Who are the most Catholic majesties of the Spain? Ferdinand and Isabella. Who did they marry their daughter off to? The King of England. Her name was Catherine of Aragon. And when her husband died, and her brother-in-law, who was 14 at the time, ascended to the throne, who married her? Henry VIII. And while she could not bear him a male heir, he decided, you know what? God's at work through me because I'm the king. I know. I'll put her away through divorce, and I'll get a woman who can bear me a son. One small problem. The Holy Father said, sorry, it doesn't work that way. Marriage is forever. It's a sacrament. You're the King of England. You were the defender of the faith until you went a little sideways here. No bueno. So Henry, as we know, says, sorry, pal, we're going to do a new thing. We're going to start our own church, and I'm going to be its head. So this is the Protestant Reformation in England, happening in 1534, 1535, 1536. That leads to a time period in England of tremendous civil war after Henry and the multiple wives that he put away are beheaded. Can you imagine the assault on the dignity of the Spanish people as a result of the daughter of the king and queen being treated in such manner? Might you want to send a fleet of ships to go and settle that issue? Spanish Armada, fortunately, sunk in a gale, didn't work out. So then after Henry, we have Elizabeth. After Elizabeth, we have Mary. After Mary, we have the Stuart kingdoms. We have constant warfare. And finally, through a civil war in England, all of that matter is put to rest. The Plantagenet line is pushed out. The Hanoverians from Germany come in, become the kings of England, and England stabilizes. And now they began to export through their naval dominance around the world, exploration and trade. That's what happened with England. France, on the other hand, they had a different policy about the New World. They were given the opportunity to go into the north, what we now call Canada, what we now call the Maritime Provinces, what we now call northern New York, the Great Lakes region of Ohio, of Illinois, of Michigan, of Minnesota, all the way down through Indiana. They explore all the Mississippi River Valley, sending missionary priests and French traders, primarily fur traders, to explore, not to conquer, but to engage in business relations with the inhabitants of the native people. The religious order that France used to share the gospel was an order that was founded specifically to address the Protestant Reformation. That order is called the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. Intellectual men at the highest level who understood that their call was really to be the spiritual Marine Corps of the church and to go out and to engage people and meet them where they are, not through conquest, but through interaction. And the Jesuits would go, live amongst the native people, learn their language, eat their food, celebrate their customs, and in doing so would make friends with them so that they could then share the gospel of their good friend, Jesus Christ. And this is how the evangelization of North America from the northern part of New York, all across the Great Lakes, all the way down through the Mississippi River Valley, all the way to the city of New Orleans, took place in our pre-colonial time period. So, Spaniards go to the New World in the southern sphere and in Central and Mesoamerica. They go on their own period of exploration through missionary activities with Franciscans and Dominicans, and the Spanish Empire, and then later the Mexican Empire that succeeded it, had Florida, Georgia, parts of South Carolina, all the way across parts of Kentucky, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, up into Kansas, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and a little place called Alta California. So all of that was under the responsibility of the Spanish Empire. And what religion are they? And so they're sending their Catholic missionaries out, all right? So when we're looking at the history of the United States of America, this is why it's important for us as Catholics in the United States of America to understand our story. Because much of what we learned in our history books, if we learned history at all, is written from the Protestant perspective of the British colonies, which were the foundation upon which the United States of America was built before it moved west through manifest destiny. So we need to understand the contribution of the North American martyrs. We need to understand the contribution of Father Jacques Marquette. We need to understand the contribution of the explorers, Sieur de La Salle, Bienville. We need to understand the unbelievable courage that it took for the Spanish captains of Cortez and Pizarro to come and meet people who wore no clothes and decorated themselves with feathers and paint, and took their children and sacrificed them to a god that looked like a serpent, that conquered their enemies and then reached into their body cavities and consumed their hearts. Think about what it would be like for any of us to go call on a client, and when they welcomed us into their place of business, invited us to have lunch, only to serve things that we found not only repulsive, but morally abhorrent. That's what our Spanish forebears were doing in this time of discovery. Spain, France, England. England had a different policy. They didn't go for God, for glory, for gold. They exported people. What does that mean? Well, remember, they'd been going through this interior conflict, and when they Parliament established stability, and then they had conquered the surrounding areas, including Ireland and Scotland, Wales and Cornwall, they had a lot of troublemakers in their midst, particularly these new Protestants called Methodists, particularly these Bible Christians who didn't respect the authority of the Church of England. Now, this is kind of interesting. Father, maybe you can help me out with this. If I'm the head of the government and I get rid of the moral authority of the Pope and I make myself the Pope, do you think that people that are subject to me might think they want to do the same thing? So they would reject my authority as Pope and King? And so this creates this interior conflict in England. And so every time a conflict people shows up, they get thrown out of the country. These people that were on the Mayflower. Where was the Mayflower before it was in what became the Massachusetts Bay Colony?
Netherlands.
Yes. So you got thrown out to the Netherlands. Does anything good come out of the Netherlands? Yes, it does.
Cigars, Dutch Masters.
Dutch masters, which again were united to the Spanish Empire.
Is it Gouda?
And Gouda, all right. So these British pilgrims come and they land in Massachusetts Bay Colony. They were actually looking for Virginia. They got off course a little bit, but they landed there with a new idea. And they held themselves together through a democratic process that they articulated, known as the Mayflower Compact, right? That they would govern themselves in a certain way. About 20 years before that, there had been a period of exploration of what was known as the Jamestown colony, which was in Virginia. And so the British are thinking, hey, if we send our troublemakers over to this new world and establish them, they can make a go of it. And so they started establishing different areas of colonialism and giving each particular troublemaker a contract for them to settle that area for the benefit of the crown and then to do trade with the crown. So they exported people, France exported the gospel, and Spain sent conquerors to then establish trade and to evangelize. So these were three different policies of the old world coming to the new world, and three different experiences of how the inhabitants of the new world encountered people from the old world. Each has its own particular story. Now, how does it impact the United States of America? In the mid-16th century, we had an age-old problem. Man's desire to dominate other men. And so the Spanish and Portuguese who were settling and developing the New World set out on a policy of what was called encomienda, which was an economic system where they would establish plantations in order to grow things and to dig things out of the ground in order then to send those products back to the old world for trade. And so there was a trade route established in the Spanish Empire that went from Western Spain to Hispaniola, Cuba, Veracruz, Mexico City, Acapulco, and then sailed across the waters to a place called Manila. And so these trade routes went on for hundreds of years. During the early part of that experience, particularly in the southern part of the hemisphere, South America, the church had an issue with that. They said, hey, look, this encomienda experience, it's really turning these native people who we met and wanted to share the gospel with, we're turning them into slaves. And that's not what God wants. If these are human beings, then they are worthy of dignity because they're made in God's image and likeness. And while previously they might have eaten the hearts of their enemies, if we evangelize them and educate them, they are every bit as capable as any of us into a level of dignity to know, love, and serve God. And so then turning them into one step above an animal, probably not what God wants us to do in the Spanish Empire. That Dominican priest's name was Bartolomeo de las Casas. And he went to Rome and in front of the Pope fought it out logically and reasonably with a guy named Sepulveda, another priest, on whether we're allowed to use people or are we called to love people. And if we love people, to share the good news of Jesus Christ with them, and they have certain rights. Think about that. Does that sound like some documents that we know in our national experience, maybe as articulated in the thing called the Declaration of Independence? So that 16th century conversation, which did in fact articulate, springboarded into this time of technology after the Gutenberg Bible, and gave rise to what the Europeans call the Age of Enlightenment, the rights of man. Not that might makes right, but that reasonably, because of our dignity as reflected in our body and soul, means that we're called to a higher level. So, this experience impacts us directly, particularly even to this day where people have lost sight of the dignity of the human person. Now, we have to take a step to the south of Europe, and we have to talk a little bit about the African slave trade and how that worked, because that has a direct impact on us in the West as well. Now remember, they're having this conversation in Portugal and Spain with the Holy Father about how do we treat the indigenous people. Well, shoot, if I can't use them anymore, who's going to do my work? I know. The Portuguese have been sailing south to south to Africa, Cape Town, India. They've established a port in Goa. They're working their way around then into Japan. Hey, there's these people in Africa that are completely different color than us, and they're pagans, and you know what? They're for sale. Because African tribes would capture other Africans in battle and sell them to the Moors. And then the Moors had a slave trade worldwide, and they were happy to sell them to the Christians. And then the Christians would put them on boats, sail them across, and then would drop them in the Caribbean, and then in South America, and in little parts of Mexico, not so much, but certainly in some of the more difficult places that the Mexican or the Spanish Empire had outposts, like Louisiana and Mississippi, where it's very hot. And these people of African descent seemed to be able to tolerate the heat better than the Spaniards. And so the slave trade began. And importing what they didn't see as fully human beings, who they could then usurp those rights, became a big part of the commercial trade of that pre-colonial time period. Now, during subsequent talks, we'll talk about how that was reconciled through British common law and obviously in the United States, what became known as the abolition movement, and then we ended up having a small thing called the Civil War that had something to say about that as well. So again, this pre-colonial experience, what do we as Catholics know about it? What do we as Catholics understand it? How can we drill down more so that as Catholics in America 250, we can articulate our story well? All right? Okay. So we've taken a big jump through history. We've done some reminders for what most of us learned in our excellent Catholic education. And it's coming up on 5 minutes to 9. I want to land this talk with just an acknowledgement of something that's very important. 24 years ago today, something happened that rocked our world, particularly those that are my age or older, maybe a little bit younger. But you guys, Gus, how old are you?
I am 23.
You're 23. 1 year before you were born, something happened. Some people thought it was a good idea to take American commercial airliners and turn them into weapons and to attack the United States of America. For whatever was their reasoning, if you want to learn about it, read a book called The Looming Tower. That'll give you the philosophy that got us to that point. If you don't read well, there's a very good miniseries on it on your streaming service, The Looming Tower by Lawrence Wright. But these guys decided it was a good idea to take commercial airliners with people on board and to fly them into buildings, including the World Trade Center, an attack on the Pentagon, and then there was another airplane that was overtaken by the passengers who then seized it, and that went into the ground in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, killing everybody on board and possibly saving either the US Capitol or the White House. That happened 24 years ago today. It's important for us to remember that. It's also important for us to remember the Catholic experience in that. That day, the city of New York became ground zero for the entire attention of the world. Who was the mayor of New York City? Rudy Giuliani, Catholic Italian. Catholic Italian who had been the U.S. attorney for the Southern District. Catholic Italian who broke the mob. Catholic Italian lawyer who became mayor of New York City.
Renovated the city.
And under the efforts of Commissioner Bill Bratton and then later Bernard Carrick, brought security and safety to the city and cleaned it up. It's an amazing man. Commissioner of New York City at that time period, Bernard Carrick, Catholic. Fire commissioner of New York City at that time, not a Catholic, but a Protestant, Christian. The first responders that went into the buildings, who was victim number one? What was his name? Do you think it's worthy of remembrance? Victim number 001. Anybody got his name?
He's a Franciscan.
He is. 9/11 for 1,000. Who's got it? Father Michael Judge.
Right.
Father Michael Judge, a Franciscan, was a chaplain for the NYFD, and when the first plane went into the towers, knew that first responders would have to go, so he books it into Lower Manhattan to be of service to people. He's there when the second tower is hit, and then when the towers come down, he's crushed. I think we can all remember the iconic photo of his brother firefighters picking up his broken body and carrying it. Do you know where they placed it? Below the altar at St. Peter's Catholic Church in Lower Manhattan, which is directly across from the World Trade Center. Father Michael Judge's body in his Franciscan habit, dust-covered, blood-covered, broken body. And that was the place where the firefighters would go for rest and revitalization when they needed to get hydrated, when they needed to get some food before they could go back in and deal with what needed to happen. The Port Authority officers who were in charge of security in the World Trade Center, vast majority Catholic. The New York Police Department, the New York Fire Department, the EMTs, vast majority Catholic. The evacuation of Manhattan Island, over 1 million people were taken off the island by the United States Coast Guard. It was the greatest seaborne evacuation in United States history. Large number of the military, Catholic. What is it about this Catholic experience that calls people to service in the military, calls people to service in the police department, calls people to service in the fire department, calls people to service in the Port Authority Police Department, calls people to service in government? Well, other than good pensions. Matt might be able to tell us a little bit about that.
That was sad.
But what is it about the Catholic experience that calls people into those experience, those service industries? Might it be that we see part of the gospel is of being service to keeping people safe, to keeping people secure, to getting people out of harm's way? I think so. Mayor Giuliani went to over 400 funerals, the vast majority of which were Catholic, in the 365 days after 9/11, while he was still trying to navigate the leadership of a city which had been knocked on its knees. That was Catholic leadership at its finest. So let's remember the Catholic experience and the Catholic contribution, not only in terms of the victims, many of which were in the World Trade Center, many of which were at Cantor Fitzgerald, including Bill Simon's cousin. That's a story for another day. But the first responders who gave their all in order to save their fellow human beings. So these are the types of stories that we'll be telling over the next 8 series. October will be in City of Hope, where we'll be talking about Catholic contribution to healthcare in the United States. And then we'll come back here in November, where Martin Bowles will be taking us through the colonial experience all the way through the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the Constitution. And then after that, we'll learn about the early era of the United States as it started to find its way, and then engaged in a armed conflict, first with the War of 1812, and then in the Mexican War with Mexico in 1848. And then after that, we'll come back and talk a little about the pre-bellum, Civil War, and early antebellum period of time. We'll talk about Reconstruction through the Gilded Age. And we'll talk about the time of the 20th century and American ascendancy into world power through the time period of Teddy Roosevelt all the way through the Second World War and up through the Cold War, and then after that, Cold War to our modern time. That's the series of Catholics in America for America 250. Now I want to point out two resources that we have available. Not only America 250, the website, but also the Nixon Libraries America 250 display, which will be in about 60 days coming on. So you should go to the Nixon Library website and download it so that you can receive information. The curator of the museum spoke to us last May, our friend Ben O'Neill, who's on the foundation there, brought him, and talked about the vision for what will be at the Nixon Library throughout the semi-quincentennial for us to go and visit, but also for us to take our children, our grandchildren, our schools, our homeschool groups, all of the people that are in our spheres of influence, perhaps our businesses, our employees, because we need to understand how special this thing called America is. And if we don't know our story, and if we can't articulate why that is, then what happened yesterday in Orem, Utah was a complete waste. This young man was politically assassinated because he dared to speak truth to a country that is awash in nihilism. What Pope Benedict XVI called the dictatorship of relativism. This is our cultural war that we have been engaged in really since 1938 and the Lambeth Conference, when the mainline Protestant churches said it was okay to bring contraception into the marriage bed. And since that time period, we've been on a downward spiral of might makes right, or does all human beings have dignity and worth? And that's what we've got to understand and be able to articulate and explain in a way where people that maybe have not had the benefit of our formation, people that have not had the benefit of a good Catholic education, a good liberal education, a good education based on Athens, Rome, Jerusalem, what we would call classical. But there's a rising generation of young people like Charlie, like Ben Shapiro, like Lila Rose, like Tucker Carlson, like Megyn Kelly, who are using this media to tell the story. And we've got to be able to be ambassadors for it. With that, I say thank you very much for your attention.